we wanted to give you a sense of some of the things going on across the state in terms of local government. We all talk a lot about how the government closest to the people is the best because we all have a better idea and a better easy connection to figuring out exactly what's going on and to play a role in the debate over what we think is appropriate use of tax dollars and what is not. That's actually the mission of Julie Tisdale here at the John Locke Foundation. She is our city and county policy analyst, and that's what she does day in and day out. She monitors what's happening at the local level across the state. And over the past several months, Julie has been writing a number of really fascinating pieces about some projects and proposals going on in different counties, whether it's in the Charlotte area or Wake County over in Rocky Mount, or soccer proposals for major league teams in Raleigh and Charlotte. So we thought this would be a good idea to give you an update on some of those ideas and proposals and to get Julie's take on whether or not what's being done in our names with our local tax dollars is appropriate. With that, please welcome Julie Tisdale from the John Locke Foundation.
Good afternoon. It is great to be with you today to talk about local government in North Carolina. I've been working on this city and county government thing for about a year and a half now, and what I've discovered is that local government is absolutely fascinating. It's a really, really interesting area. We think a lot about big federal and state programs. We talk about education, and we talk about healthcare, and we talk about really big picture stuff. That gets most of the media attention. But local government affects areas that are really, really close to us, really close to our lives every day. And that makes this a fascinating area to work in. And so I've learned a lot, and I'm going to share a little bit today about some of those issues that I've seen, some of the ways that I think local governments are getting it right. I do actually have one or two good examples, and then some ways that local governments really aren't. So first of all, a little bit about what local governments even do. Off the top of your head, I don't know how many things you can think of that local governments are responsible for, but it is a ton. So I'm going to open up this presentation by doing exactly the thing they tell you should never do in PowerPoint. I'm going to throw up a slide with tons of words that are probably too small for you to even read. But let's see if this clicker works. This is the list from the UNC School of Government of things that local governments have some responsibility for. Now, local governments have full responsibility for some of the things on this list. Others are sort of shared responsibility. But it's a pretty wide range of things. You don't need to read everything up here. But we've got libraries, we've got streets and sidewalks, we've got sewers, wastewater, we've got courts, social services, mental health. I mean, it's pretty all-encompassing. Sheriff's departments, jails. So a lot of really important stuff that's going on at the local government level. And you can see how a lot of this stuff is very close. You know, your city street and street lighting really affects your drive home every day. It's not earth-shattering stuff, but it really matters to you if those things aren't functioning well. So this is the important stuff that local governments do. Now, clearly, doing all of this costs a bit of money. So local government funding is another really key issue. Most of you probably know that the primary source of funding for local governments is property taxes. It's not the only source by any stretch. It's a little less than half, but it's the big one. There are a lot of other taxes, some sales tax, there's utility bills for cities that run utilities, there's, let's see what else, some like federal and state government transfers, but those are usually for specific programs. But the big one's property tax, and property tax is important for a couple of reasons. Number one, cities and counties can pretty much levy those sort of where they want to. They can sort of set that rate. There is a cap, but nobody's close to it. So they've got a lot of latitude on the rate that they charge, and then the monies that they collect are unrestricted. They can use those for any legal purpose. So property tax is really key. Last year, property taxes in North Carolina equaled $10 billion. So we're talking about significant money here. What this map shows is the total amount of property tax collected in those counties. Now that's county and city property taxes, right? So just be clear that this is not just the county rates, but it's per county. Those really dark red ones more than $90 million in property tax. So Wake County, more than $90 million in property taxes last year. You can see that that's not an even distribution across the state. The urban areas clearly are collecting more, the rural areas less. But overall, this works out to about $1,000 per person, not per taxpayer, per person per year in North Carolina that we're paying in property taxes. And everybody's paying that. You're paying that if you own a home, obviously, or a business. But you're also paying if you rent. It affects your rental rate because the property owner is going to have to pay that tax. And you know, I don't know about you, but on my list of ways to spend $1,000, giving it to the local government isn't very high. Tickets to Aruba are kind of way above that. But we're all given $1,000 a year or so in property taxes, plus all those others. Therefore, it's really important how that money's being spent. Are they spending it for things that are actually important, or things that we value as citizens? And the answer to that often is no. I've looked this year a little bit at convention and event centers. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those. First of all, the Raleigh Convention Center, you'll recognize it probably here on the bottom left. The Raleigh Convention Center it's really interesting. A couple of months ago, I saw this headline in the Triangle Business Journal: Raleigh Convention Center director wants to double its size. And this surprised me a little bit because everything that I had heard indicated that the convention center was losing tons of money. So I thought, well, maybe I've got this wrong. Maybe the convention center is actually doing really well. That'd be fantastic. It's doing really well. It's making money. It needs to grow. So I started to dig into those numbers a little bit. Turns out I was right, actually. The convention center, last year, revenue from events totaled about $6 million. Expenses was about $8 million. So that's a hole. And then I thought, well, maybe it's because of the way they do the accounting. In the city finances, they group together the convention center and the performing arts center. So I said, well, maybe if we look at that whole complex as a whole, maybe the picture's better. But it's not. User charges were $14 million and expenses were $17 million for that whole complex last year. And then we need to throw in $25.5 million just last year for debt service on that building. So we are deeply, deeply in the hole. And so I'm thinking, why in the world do we want to expand this? The director says, well, it's busy every weekend. We're turning business away. And he's right. They are busy. There's an event there almost every weekend of the year, and often during the week. That's because we're subsidizing it. The Convention Center Financing Fund put in about $20 million last year. That's funding that comes from occupancy taxes, prepared food taxes. Every time you go out to a meal, you're contributing to this convention center fund. Anywhere in Wake County, not just in Raleigh, anywhere in Wake County, you're contributing to that. And so if you're giving away rooms for free and giving away event space for free and deeply subsidized at deeply subsidized rates, you are going to fill up. It seems to me that the better approach here would be to raise what we're charging for those rooms and try to turn this into a positive revenue stream, but that has not been the approach. You'll see also down here the Charlotte Convention Center. It's a similar picture in Charlotte. It may be even worse. I'm going to be doing some work on that in the coming months, so keep an eye out for some work on the Charlotte Convention Center. And at the top, we have a picture that Lige will recognize, I'm sure. This is from Rocky Mount. This is the Rocky Mount proposed downtown community facility. And I've written about that. If you want to go on our website, you can learn more. It has been quite the saga in Rocky Mount. This has been going on for like 5 years now. They finally broke ground a couple of weeks ago on this facility. It's going to be 175,000 square feet, seating for 5,000, and it's going to focus on amateur sports. But all of the work that they've done with consultants who have come in to analyze how much money this is going to make, it's all real questionable. The numbers just don't seem to quite add up. There are real questions for me about whether you're going to be able to attract major amateur sporting events to Rocky Mount. I'm not quite sure what this facility offers over some other competing facilities. And it's going to cost a ton of money. The the City Council is doing this through issuing special obligation bonds, which are a type of bond that is not subject to public referenda. Voters did not have to go to the polls and vote on this event center for Rocky Mount. And yet, the city has issued $34 million in bonds, plus there's an expectation that they'll pay about $17 million in interest payment on those, for a total of about $51 million. And on top of that, taxpayers will be responsible for any operating deficits, which seem likely to me. Even the most optimistic projections are for significant operating deficits for the first 3 or 4 years. And so we've got the taxpayers, without a vote, on the hook for tens of millions of dollars in Rocky Mount that has a declining population and some declining property values. This is a pretty bold move on the part of the City Council. I hope it's successful. I hope this is wildly successful and Rocky Mount booms as a result. But I'm skeptical of that. In fact, I wonder whether we're going to end up with further incentives that the City Council ends up giving to get a hotel built, because they need some hotel facilities if they're going to have these 5,000 people coming to view amateur sporting events. There are just lots of questions about how all of this is going to work. And yet they've been able to do it. Moving on to a little bit of a different type of event, Donna mentioned Major League Soccer. This is something I've looked at a lot. Major League Soccer is expanding, and so in just January, 12 cities put forward bids to host the next Major League Soccer franchises. Amongst those were Charlotte and Raleigh. There are two really different pictures of how to do this that we see in these two bids. First of all, let me start with Charlotte. This picture here on the screen is a rendering of what the stadium in Charlotte might look like. There's a bid. The bid involves a $175 million stadium. This bid's being led by Marcus Smith, who's the son of Bruton Smith, who owns the Speedway in Charlotte and in lots of other cities. These are very rich people with a lot of money and a history of success in running sporting businesses. In fairness to them, they've done this well. They've made a lot of money running racetracks. Despite that, they went to the taxpayers or to the City Council and the County Commission and said, we want you guys to subsidize this, and heavily. So $175 million stadium for soccer. The proposal was that the Smiths would pay for half of that, and the city and the county would split the other half. So the county agreed they'd pay their $43.75 million towards this stadium. Oh, and also, by the way, the Smiths were kind of going to pay for that other half. They were kind of going to pay for their, $87.5 million. But they were going to do so with a $70 million loan, also from the county, which the county agreed to. And as part of this whole deal, the county was going to retain ownership of the stadium, which might sound like a great thing. The county gets this asset. But if the county owns the stadium, then the stadium isn't subject to property taxes. So this is a fantastic deal for the Smiths. Fortunately, when all of this went down and the county approved this, I'm watching this meeting and just thinking, you have got to be kidding me. They cannot be doing this. But they did. Fortunately, about an hour later, the city stepped in and said, we're not even going to vote on this. This clearly doesn't align with our priorities. We're not ready to move on this yet. So if you want to proceed with your bid on your own, that's fine. But the city's not putting up our $43 million. Good for them. The Smiths have gone ahead with that bid. It looks really unlikely that they'll win that. But kudos to the city of Charlotte for saying this is not a good way. This is not a priority for taxpayer money to be spent on a stadium that's primarily going to benefit the owners of the team. In contrast, we've seen a bid from Steve Malik and North Carolina FC, which is the former Carolina Railhawks. They also are bidding for one of those same franchises. They also would have a stadium that would probably cost $150 million or so, but they're saying they'll privately fund it. They may ask for a little bit from the city in terms of like parking and some infrastructure investment, But basically, they're going to fund it with private dollars. I think that's a really positive model. That's a way that these things can be done without taxpayers being on the hook. Steve Malek's going to benefit hugely if this is successful. So he and his investors putting forward the money seems like a reasonable way to do things. It's not just Major League Soccer stadiums, though. The other thing we've seen a lot of is minor league ballparks. This has been amazing. Every town in North Carolina, it appears, wants to have a minor league ballpark. Now, I'm a huge baseball fan, so I love the idea of there being minor league ball teams just everywhere scattered across North Carolina. That sounds fantastic to me. But often, the funding plans for these rely heavily on taxpayer subsidies. So this is another chart. I know you can't read any of this. That's not important. This is for Fayetteville, Cumberland County, and they want to they have signed an agreement. This is going to happen. They've signed an agreement with the Houston Astros for one of their minor league ball teams. The dark blue that you see at the top, that's the Astros lease payments. That's 18%. Again, I know this is tiny, but I nicked it off of Fayetteville's website. And the light blue beside it, that's parking. That's 9%. So we got a total of 27% there. The rest of that pie chart is all taxpayer funding of some sort for a $33 million stadium where a Houston Astros minor league team will play. Now, what's particularly interesting about this one is that at least some significant chunk of this money is going to come from a tax increase that was brought in to pay for schools. When I read this headline, this was another one where I said, this can't be right. I've got to be misreading this, right? There's no way that they're diverting money from schools to build a ballpark. But they are. They had raised taxes a year or two ago, planning to put that into capital expenditure for schools in Cumberland County. But they had this opportunity to get this ball team, and so they're looking for revenue sources, and they say, oh, we've got that tax increase that isn't actually allocated yet. Let's reallocate this to the ballpark. And they couldn't do it without the approval of the school board, but the school board agreed to this proposal. And so instead of investing in kids and schools in Cumberland County, they're going to build a ballpark that's primarily going to benefit the business owners who own the team. Now, there may be some marginal benefit for the community, but this is largely about those business owners. And again, I love the idea of building a ballpark, but we shouldn't be doing it at the expense of schools. Cumberland County has $143 million in self-reported capital needs for their school. They need buildings, they need computers, that kind of spending. That's all money that the county could put in, but instead they're building this ballpark. Transportation is another one on that list from the UNC School of Government. And lots of different aspects of transportation are the responsibility of local government. City streets, which includes bike lanes, so I'll get to that in a bit. Public transportation, whether that's buses or light rail or whatever kind of public transportation you want to put in. So a couple of things. We've looked at bike lanes, particularly in Raleigh, over the past year. This is a map that I found that I thought was quite interesting. This is the percentage of workers who use a bike to get to work by state. The exact numbers here aren't real important. The purple is 2% or greater, so that's the top. The yellow and the orange are less than 0.4%. You'll notice that the entire southeast, apart from Florida, the entire southeast is yellow or orange. Nobody in this area bikes to work. Cycling for recreation is a different matter. We do have lots of enthusiastic cyclists. But when it comes to getting to work, in Raleigh, it's 0.6% of the population that gets to work by bike. In Charlotte, it's 0.2%. It's very, very low numbers of people who use a bike for economic activity. And it seems to me that when we're talking about transportation dollars, we primarily ought to be focused not on recreation, but on things that foster economic development, things that allow people to get to jobs, to get to shopping, to conduct business, things that contribute to the economy. That's where we ought to be putting our limited transportation dollars. Instead, the city of Raleigh has spent millions of dollars on bike lanes. You will have noticed them as you drive around town, I'm sure. They have done that at the expense of lanes for motorized traffic. So lanes have been narrowed, or we've gone from 4 lanes to 3, or you've seen these patterns over the past few years. I would argue this is not a good investment of taxpayer dollars and should not be our focus. But it doesn't stop with bike lanes in Raleigh. Any of you who are from Wake County will be aware that we voted on a tax increase, a sales tax increase of 0.5% in November. That was to fund the Wake County Transit Plan. The Wake County Transit Plan is $2.3 billion over 10 years, and it will go beyond that, but the first 10 years is $2.3 billion for commuter rail, bus rapid transit, and regular buses. Bus rapid transit is a little bit of a different thing. It uses regular buses, but on dedicated lanes. Sometimes there are physical barriers that keep other traffic from getting into those lanes. So it's kind of it's extra expensive buses is really what it is, because you got to build extra lanes and you push cars out of those lanes. So regular buses, bus rapid transit. Oh, and it also gives priority at stoplights and stuff. So the bus is coming, the stoplight changes to allow the bus to come through. That's all involved in BRT. It's more expensive than regular buses. The Raleigh plan, though, would put $2.3 billion into that. The sales tax increase that we voted on and that was approved in November will provide 36% of that funding. The projections over the first 10 years are that fare box revenue from all of those different, from the buses, from the commuter rail, from all of that, will pay for 4% of that project. So the long-term plan from Wake County is to subsidize this whole deal 96%. That doesn't sound like a good deal to me. And actually, if you look at where the routes are going to be, most people in Wake County won't be able to use that as a convenient form of transportation from work to home. They live too far from a stop, or they work too far from a stop. Or they'd have to go into the middle of town and back out, and it'll take 3 times as long as driving. So this is not a convenient mode of transportation for very many people, and yet we're going to subsidize 96% of the cost over the next 10 years through general taxation that all of us will pay. It's a sales tax, we'll all pay that. And that is before we even get to Charlotte, where you've probably heard about light rail. The short story on Charlotte is that nobody rides the light rail, and they keep putting millions and millions and millions more dollars into it. Just last week, this top headline is from March 24th. This is last Friday. The Charlotte Area Transit System asks for another $25 million for light rail construction. They have continued to go back and ask for more money and more money and more money. And yet, nobody's riding it. The ridership numbers are abysmal. They're declining. The Charlotte Business Journal earlier this month ran a piece about this, and I'm going to read a couple of quotes from that just to capture how bad the picture is in Charlotte. Shannon Benz, Executive Director of Advocacy Group Sustain Charlotte, these are pro-transit folks, referred to Federal Transit Administration data showing local combined ridership fell by 8% in calendar year 2016, despite an influx of young professionals and apartments. The decline comes in spite of Mecklenburg County increasing its population by 12.2% between 2010 and 2015, according to the Census Bureau. Light rail failed to make gains even as the number of uptown residents increased by 29% to 16,500 between 2011 and 2016. In nearby South End, the residential population jumped 87% to 9,100 during the same period. And those numbers are from an analysis by Charlotte City Partners, Charlotte Center City Partners, which again is a pro-transit group and does a lot of that sort of downtown development stuff in Charlotte. So you've got dramatic increases in population, and nobody's riding light rail, and we keep putting money into it. Oh, well, if we just put some more money and increase the speed or the frequency or the number of destinations, then people will finally ride it. Only possibly they won't. Last year, this second headline is from my favorite article of all time about Charlotte Transit, which was in the Charlotte Observer in June. And again, I'm going to read a quote from this. Chris Walker, who lives at the Silos South End apartment complex, is one of thousands of people drawn to living within a stone's throw of the Lynx Blue Line. Walker likes being close to light rail, but he doesn't actually use it all that much. Quote, "I've lived here a year and a half and I've taken the train twice," said Walker, whose apartment is less than a quarter mile from the New Bern Light Rail Station at the southernmost part of South End. "We use Uber instead. For $5 you can get uptown. It's easy." So we're putting all of this public money into trains, and people are hopping on Uber instead because it's more convenient and it's cheaper. And these are millennials, these are target market who live less than a quarter mile from the train. So I would argue that all of these projects that I've talked about represent misplaced priorities on the part of local governments. We've got bike lanes, we've got transit that nobody rides, we've got ballparks that we're building for private ball clubs and owners. Those dollars instead should be focused on core functions, on things that improve economic development opportunities in the city. We ought to be investing in keeping our city streets really well maintained. Last weekend, I saw a police officer at 8:30 on a Saturday night, literally in the middle of Six Forks Road with a shovel, working on a pothole. I have no idea why in the world this was happening, but we've got potholes so bad that we've got a city police officer out there at 8:30 at night with a shovel. Maybe we ought to prioritize that over some of these other projects. We've got schools needs. So this is all about sort of misplaced priorities, I would argue. And yet, I want to end on a hopeful note. This all looks pretty bleak, but one of the beauties of local government is that it is really close to people. And because it's close, it means our access to county commissioners and city council members is much, much better, much easier than sort of national and even state representatives. It also means that the electorates are much smaller. In Wake County, there's about 1 million people. In Raleigh, there's less than 500,000. So when you vote in local elections, your voice is amplified and it really matters. So I would encourage you to get involved in local elections, in local politics. Write to your county commissioners, write to your city council members, be vocal, because they really do listen. Not always as much as we'd like, but you really do have a voice there, and there's some real hope for impact because they are so close to us. And with that, I'll take questions.